July 1st, 1901. Brothers Peter and Hermann Stube, 6 and 8, left their home on Germany's largest island, Rugen, to pick some blackberries. But by the time dinner was served by their parents, the boys had still not returned. So their father, alongside several neighbors and a local policeman from their village, headed out to search for them. But they had seemingly vanished. Reporting them missing, a large group of volunteers began searching the surrounding area, assuming the two boys had wandered off and gotten lost. But by the next morning, it was clear something much worse had happened. In the nearby forest, a neighbor helping search for the boys stumbled across a scene that must have been like something straight out of a nightmare. Both boys had been brutally murdered, with their killer dismembering them and leaving a mess of organs and body parts scattered over a 500-meter area of the forest. Peter's skull had been crushed. His neck had been severed at the spine. His intestines had been pulled out of his stomach, and his heart had been removed. Hermann had had his lower body severed, with his legs being found far from his body. Even more disturbingly, Hermann's heart had also been removed and was never found. A few days earlier, a number of sheep had been discovered slaughtered and dismembered at a nearby pasture, which the locals believed were the result of either witchcraft rituals or some sort of monster like a werewolf. So it was hard for the villagers not to see the murder of the boys as somehow linked to something supernatural as well. But the police did not take these claims seriously. And as they began investigating who could have done this to the two innocent children, they discovered a single witness who claimed to have seen the young boys chatting with a man the afternoon they disappeared. That man was a local carpenter called Ludwig Tesno. Finding him on a beach near Binz, investigators questioned where he was last night. But he calmly told them he had been at home, had been working all day, and that they had the wrong man. They may have actually believed him, if not for what they discovered when they went to search his home. In his house, they found damp clothing that had been washed, covered in dark stains that looked unnervingly like blood. They even discovered a pair of heavily stained boots that he'd tried and failed to scrub clean. Ludwig denied that he had been cleaning off bloodstains. Instead, he claimed the dark marks were the result of wood dye and varnish that had splashed on his clothes during his work. Not believing him, police arrested him, certain he was the killer. Yet Ludwig seemed calm and rational. Could such a man really be responsible for such extreme and gruesome violence? And if it was him, local residents couldn't help but question, had they caught a killer, or had they caught something much worse? The word werewolf was never uttered. But the villagers whispered that Ludwig's calm visage must be hiding some sort of beast to be able to have done such a thing. This is the story of the mad carpenter Ludwig Tesno, also known as Ludwig was initially held in a shed at the Binz Fire Department, where they arranged a carriage to transport him to a train station. Along the way, large crowds gathered, wanting vigilante justice for the horrific murders of the Stube boys, resulting in clashes with the escorting police officers. When they eventually managed to get Ludwig to a prison in Greifswald, they began their formal interrogation. Yet as they questioned him, Ludwig remained adamant that they had the wrong man, and that the red stains on his clothes really were from carpenter's varnish. He almost seemed believable, making them question if they'd made a mistake. But then, as they began looking into Ludwig's past, they discovered a chilling revelation that changed everything about how they thought of him. Because just 3 years earlier, Ludwig had been a key suspect in an uncannily similar murder investigation in which 2 young girls were found dismembered in a forest near Lechtingen. On the morning of September 9th, 1898, 2 7-year-old girls, Elsa Langemeyer and Hannah-Laura Heidmann, left for school like they did every other day. Yet, on this occasion, they never arrived. This prompted a huge search effort spearheaded by their parents, but the 2 girls couldn't be found anywhere in the village. By evening, the search had expanded to the nearby forests, and to the horror of the volunteers, they soon stumbled across the mutilated and dismembered body of Hannah-Laura. Much like the murders of the Stube brothers, she had been savagely broken and torn apart, and her body pieces were scattered around a vast area. Within a few hours, they had discovered Elsa's body in the same forest, having suffered the same unimaginable fate. As police began their investigation, interviewing everyone in the village, they learned that Ludwig had been seen leaving the forest on the day the girls were killed. The same witness claimed that Ludwig's clothes looked like they were heavily stained with something dark that resembled blood. Police rushed to arrest Ludwig, finding him still wearing the stained clothes. Yet he quickly explained the marks away as being wood dye from a carpentry job, claiming he had been returning from work when he was spotted near the woods. As police interrogated him, Ludwig showed no signs of anxiety, and police felt he appeared rational and sound. Not the type of person who could have committed such violence only hours earlier. Although they did find a button in the forest near one of the crime scenes that matched those on Ludwig's suit, which Ludwig claimed had been lost weeks earlier. They ultimately released him, believing his claim about the wood dye and having no other evidence linking him to the murders. While it might seem strange to us that they released him, it's worth remembering that at the time, the prevailing belief was that only someone with a severe mental illness could commit such heinous acts of murder. So the fact that Ludwig was calm, rational, and normal seeming to them practically cleared him of suspicion. Supposedly, in the weeks after the murders, Ludwig was frequently seen around the village wearing the stained clothes that he had made no attempt to clean. If the stains were wood dye, this perhaps makes sense. But if they were blood from the girls, this can only be seen as the sick and arrogant boasting of a brutal killer who believed himself to be untouchable. By 1899, Ludwig had moved away, and nobody in his new village had any idea about his potential involvement in the murder of the two young girls. With evidence linking him to two unquestionably similar crimes, the police now had no doubt that Ludwig was their killer. However, whereas last time there had been no way to prove that Ludwig's claims about the stains on his clothes weren't true, this time there was. It had been a common problem for investigators in the past to prove that bloodstains belonged to a victim. Without the sort of technology we have nowadays, it wasn't uncommon for killers to claim any stains or blood had come from animals, not humans. And police had had no way to prove otherwise. But that all changed in February 1901, just 5 months before the murder of the Stube brothers, thanks to a scientist at the University of Greifswald called Paul Uhlenhuth. Uhlenhuth had developed a test capable of distinguishing between human blood and animal blood, revolutionizing forensic investigations. The new test worked through the antigen-antibody reaction. By injecting rabbits with human blood, their immune systems would produce antibodies against human proteins. When blood from these rabbits was then processed into a serum and mixed with diluted human blood, the mixture would visibly clump together. Crucially, this reaction did not happen with paint or animal blood. The test had never been used in a criminal case before, but following discussions between the local prosecutor, Ernst Hubschmann, and the examining magistrate, it was decided to enlist Uhlenhuth's expertise to perform forensic analysis on the clothing and footwear recovered from Ludwig's home. Uhlenhuth personally handled the evidence and the testing to see if the stains on Ludwig's clothes were wood dye or human blood, with multiple stains across his clothing requiring multiple tests. While he was able to confirm that some of the stains were indeed wood dye, as Ludwig had claimed, the vast majority of them were undeniably human blood. In his report, he noted that human blood was found in 6 areas on Ludwig's coat, 7 spots on his trousers, 4 locations on his waistcoat, and 1 each on his cap and vest. As well as human blood, however, he found traces of sheep's blood on Ludwig's jacket and trousers. This all but confirmed that Ludwig had not only killed the Stube brothers, but that he had been responsible for the mutilated sheep found a few days before their murders. While technology at the time did not enable them to confirm whose blood was on Ludwig's clothing, it was deemed strong enough evidence to charge him with murder. And by the summer of 1902, the trial for the Monster of Rugen was set to begin. Although the prosecution believed the evidence overwhelmingly proved Ludwig's guilt in the murder of the Stube brothers, what was less obvious was whether he could be held mentally responsible for the crime. Ludwig had been sent to the Ueckermünde sanatorium for months to be observed. During his time there, 6 separate psychiatrists examined him independently, and all of them concluded that he was not mentally accountable at the time of the killings. They discovered that Ludwig had spent hours at the crime scenes after the murders, moving body parts around. They argued that a rational killer would have tried to cover his tracks and flee, leading them to believe that Ludwig was insane and must suffer from some sort of severe mental illness. Uhlenhuth served as the chief prosecution witness, testifying about his findings that contradicted Ludwig's claims that the stains on his clothing were from wood dye. Despite the claims of insanity and mental illness, the prosecutor dismissed the psychiatric reports, urging the jury to convict Ludwig without hesitation to ensure this monster would be removed from society. The jury agreed, and Ludwig was found guilty and sentenced to death by guillotine, even though the law prohibited capital punishment in cases of diminished mental capacity. This led to outrage among the psychiatric community, who questioned why they had been consulted at all if their findings were just going to be ignored. Ludwig's execution was scheduled for October 17, 1903 at Greifswald prison, but the night before, he suffered a violent seizure and lost consciousness. As a result, he was transferred to the Greifswald Mental Hospital, with his execution postponed. While there, his defense opened an appeal, citing his apparent mental illness, and succeeded in getting his case reopened. At his second trial, the same debate between psychiatric experts and the prosecution played out, with the defense fighting for Ludwig to be deemed not mentally responsible, and thus unable to be executed. However, the jury ultimately reached the same conclusion as they did in the first trial, sentencing Ludwig to death again. Newspapers at the time, such as the Berliner Tag, supported the verdict, claiming it didn't matter if he was sane or disturbed, he needed to be killed for his crimes. Ludwig was then beheaded in 1904. At least, that's the typical ending to this narrative that gets retold. But it might not actually be true. There are actually no documents or judicial files that exist regarding Ludwig's execution, bringing into question if it actually happened or not. In 2014, researcher Jan Armbruster discovered in his exploration of the case that Ludwig's sentence was actually quietly commuted from death to life imprisonment, a claim that was backed up by historian Andreas Albers, who extensively researched the case using newspaper archives from the time. Then, in 2016, research into files from the Stralsund State Mental Hospital revealed that Ludwig was transferred to a highly secure section there in 1913, where he remained until 1939 as an uncured patient. According to Albers and Armbruster, he was then moved to Neustadt in West Prussia, where, as part of the Nazis' euthanasia program, the hospital was cleared in November, with around 300 patients, including Ludwig, taken to Poland and executed by the SS in what is now known as the Piaśnica massacre. Paul Uhlenhuth's method for identifying blood quickly gained acceptance. Just over a year after Ludwig's first trial, it was officially adopted as a legally recognized procedure. This testing method was later adapted to identify other bodily fluids, including saliva and semen. Though modern forensics use far more advanced and specific methods nowadays, Uhlenhuth, despite being instrumental in this breakthrough, ultimately followed a darker path in his later career under the Nazis. During that time, he helped identify and remove Jewish scientists from medical roles and proposed various unethical immunization experiments on prisoners. Although Ludwig wasn't referred to as a werewolf at his trial or in the aftermath of his conviction, it's obvious why there was some local speculation about him being one. His obsessive dismembering of both animals and humans perfectly echoed the brutal behaviors often associated with werewolf legends, and from the 1300s onwards, there were countless accounts of werewolf killers across Europe committing similar crimes. On the whole, this case feels like it sits in an interesting time in criminal history, where simultaneously these sorts of outdated beliefs still existed, even if they were less prevalent, and new scientific theories were finding their footing and clashing with them. While there isn't an excessive amount of information about this case out there, the fact that it was the first to feature a type of forensic blood analysis to convict a killer makes it an important one in the history of true crime. Whatever fate ultimately befell Ludwig, it was far kinder than that of his victims, who suffered immense brutality at his hands, making the nickname the Monster of Rugen an extremely fitting one for him. And with that, our exploration of this historic true crime case comes to a close. This was a slightly shorter video than usual, so let me know if you liked me going into a case with less available details to explore like this, or if you'd prefer to see more deep dives on the channel. Obviously, when it comes to historic crimes, it can be hard to gather significant evidence to dissect, as at the end of the day, there often isn't much evidence in the first place. But still, I thought it was an interesting case, and it wasn't one I'd personally heard of before starting my research into it. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and drop a comment down below to help with the algorithm. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss. In the 1500s, Europe was a land of constant war, conflict, and political turmoil. Amid this backdrop, in the Holy Roman Empire, Peter Nears became infamous for his 15-year spree of violence and murder that allegedly resulted in the deaths of 544 individuals, including 24 fetuses that he removed from pregnant women. If contemporary reports are to be believed, Peter is not only a candidate for being history's most prolific serial killer, but his reign of terror encompassed nearly every heinous act imaginable. Robbery, murder, torture, infanticide, cannibalism, and even dabbling in black magic. While the story of Peter Nears may not be as well known as those of historic killers like Vlad the Impaler or Elizabeth Bathory, it is just as creepy and unnerving. According to reports at the time, Peter, who led a group of bandits, was a master of black magic, possessing the ability to vanish into thin air and to transform into various animals and objects to evade capture. Supposedly, Peter made a deal with the devil, and these dark powers came from his gruesome habit of consuming fetuses, with claims that he carried the severed hands and feet of infants and unborn babies in a leather pouch to use in his twisted rituals. But how much of his legend is actually true? With his story retold in contemporary ballads, pamphlets, and reports, as well as official documents, Peter was undeniably a real historical figure and a real serial killer. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the claims about his occult rituals, cannibalistic tendencies, and satanic worship are real too. To this day, it remains unclear whether he truly committed the 544 murders he confessed to, or whether that unbelievably high body count was simply the result of the extreme torture that he underwent prior to his execution, which was one of the most gruesome ever recorded. This is the story of Born in 1540 in what is now Germany, Peter grew up as a peasant, a grueling life marked by constant hardship. Long hours, cramped cottages, barely enough food to survive, and crushing taxes from the nobility and the church pushed peasants like Peter to the brink. As you can imagine, this fueled a deep resentment, and it wasn't uncommon for peasants to revolt against their wealthy overlords. With the memory of the German Peasants' War of the 1520s lingering in the minds of the locals, uprisings erupted frequently around Peter, and were met with swift and brutal suppression by those in power desperate to maintain control. Similarly, Europe was caught in religious conflict, with Roman Catholics and Protestants vying for control in a land where fears of witchcraft and the occult were all too common. As a Protestant in a largely Catholic region, Peter faced condemnation and hatred from many of those around him. Highwaymen and bandits thrived amidst this chaotic climate, and with no formal education and having grown up surrounded by all this violence, by the time he was an adult, Peter was heading down a dark path of crime. Perhaps Peter saw this as the only way to escape his circumstances, or as a means to acquire the power and wealth his life as a peasant meant he was never going to have. Or perhaps Peter just saw it as a way to live out his violent and depraved fantasies. Learning the ropes from a famous bandit, Martin Steer, by 1566, Peter had formed his own gang, with 24 men following his orders. Steer was known for his extreme violence, carrying out a 22-year murder rampage that spanned all the way to the Netherlands, before he was arrested and executed in 1572. Supposedly, Steer used black magic rituals to aid his violent crimes, and as his apprentice, Peter was taught how to use the dark arts to further the success of his own gang of bandits. Being mentored by a vicious occult killer, it isn't surprising that Peter's own gang of outlaws used similarly brutal and violent tactics. Operating on the fringes of cities in the region of Alsace, his gang would lie in wait to ambush carriages and rob unsuspecting travelers. But while some outlaws simply intended to rob their targets, Peter and his gang were known to murder anyone who crossed their paths. Initially using isolated roads and forest land as their hunting grounds, as Peter and his gang's confidence grew, they even began targeting towns and villages, terrorizing the borderlands between Germany and France. Marching into the streets, the armed outlaws would rob, rape, and murder entire villages for nothing more than the thrill of doing it. As you can imagine, it wasn't long before stories of their shocking deeds spread. But as their legend and notoriety grew, so did demand on the authorities to stop them. Despite desperate attempts from both the locals and the nobility to find and execute Peter, he somehow managed to always stay one step ahead of them. That is, until one of his own gang members betrayed him. This led to Peter being apprehended in 1577 in Gersbach, temporarily putting an end to his 11-year reign of terror. While I was unable to find any specific mention of why this gang member betrayed him, I feel like it's safe to assume that either some form of money was involved, or the individual was captured and given leniency for his own crimes by helping authorities capture Peter and other fellow gang members. After being tortured, Peter confessed to having committed 75 murders, many of his claimed victims being local women who had mysteriously vanished over the years. But just when it seemed he was destined for execution, Peter made a daring escape, with some reports claiming he vanished from custody as if into thin air. Any relief the locals felt after his arrest was short-lived, and it wouldn't be long before Peter would resume his murder spree. Except this time, his actions were much, much darker. After escaping from captivity in what many deemed as an unexplainable and supernatural way, the story of Peter shifted from tales of a violent murderer to stories of a supernatural monster. His horrifying deeds were retold in pamphlets, books, and songs that were widely circulated across the region. These reports of Peter's dark and violent deeds were no longer just about how many people he had killed, but now contained horrific stories of cannibalism, occult rituals, and supposed supernatural abilities. According to the ballads and accounts from the time, after making his escape, Peter regrouped with the members of his gang who hadn't been arrested, and, deep in a dark forest in Pfalzburg, forged an alliance with a dark and sinister power, the devil himself. In exchange for his loyalty and his soul, it's claimed that Peter was granted supernatural powers to continue his violent crimes. Among his abilities was the power to shape-shift into various animals and objects to evade capture. Supposedly, Peter would conduct dark magic rituals by creating candles from the remains of fetuses cut from their mothers' wombs that, when lit, would render him invisible to conduct his crimes. His other gruesome acts were said to include severing the hands and feet of babies, eating their hearts, and mutilating the bodies of young girls he murdered. It's possible that the true inspiration for the stories about his supernatural invisibility and shape-shifting came from Peter's adept skills in disguising his appearance. Constantly altering his clothing and features, Peter was reported to have pretended to be a soldier, a merchant, and even a leper in order to evade capture and to commit his violent crimes. However, according to a warrant issued for his arrest in 1579, despite frequently altering his appearance, he was always seen to be carrying a large amount of money with him, as well as 2 loaded pistols and an imposing broadsword. In another description from a folk song at the time, Peter was described as having a long scar etched across his chin, 2 crooked fingers, and appearing rather old. By 1581, Peter's story and description had spread far and wide. Everybody knew who he was, and everybody was afraid of him. Tales of his violent crimes had been circulating for over a decade at this point, and he had become one of the most wanted criminals in all of Europe. With all eyes looking for him, Peter decided to lay low at a small inn called the Bells in Neumarkt. But while there, believing nobody had recognized him, he let his guard down and headed over to a public bathhouse, leaving his belongings with the innkeeper. Among the belongings the innkeeper was asked to watch over was a small leather pouch that Peter stated was extremely valuable. Not questioning it, the innkeeper felt the pouch, surprised to find it filled with something soft and not money, and stashed it away safely. But as soon as he left, another guest began whispering that he recognized Peter as the wanted criminal. With the other guests intrigued and terrified by the idea that the black magic murderer had just been in their presence, they asked the innkeeper to open the leather pouch that had been left to see what was inside of it. So the innkeeper retrieved the pouch, untied the rope holding it shut, and slowly pried it open. But as soon as he saw what was inside, he recoiled in horror and disgust. The surrounding guests all looked into the pouch to see a collection of severed baby hands and dried-out fetal hearts. They now had no doubt that the man staying at the inn was Peter Nears, and that they were holding evidence of his dark magic rituals. Although terrified of Peter's powers, the locals believed that he would be unable to use his abilities to evade them since he did not have his pouch on him. So they wasted no time, gathering up a posse of 8 strong men to ambush him at the bathhouse and apprehend him. Restrained and with no means of escaping, Peter admitted who he was to his captors and was taken into custody. At the time, it wasn't uncommon for prisoners, particularly those accused of murder, to be tortured in the most horrific ways imaginable, which frequently led to outlandish and false confessions. In September 1581, a large crowd gathered to witness the slow and agonizing torture of the notorious killer who had haunted their nightmares for the last decade. What followed was one of the most horrific executions in the history of Europe. According to ballads and pamphlets written at the time, Peter suffered 3 days of agonizing torture, during which he confessed to murdering a staggering 544 individuals, including 24 pregnant women, who he had killed to remove their unborn babies for use in his rituals. It's worth pointing out, other contemporary reports claim that Peter openly confessed to the 544 murders after being captured in the bathhouse, not as a result of his torture. On the first day, strips of flesh were torn from Peter's body before boiling oil was poured into the gaping wounds. On the second day, his feet were covered in grease and held over burning coals, causing his flesh to melt as he was roasted alive. And on the third day, he was dragged through the streets and tied to the infamous breaking wheel, where his body was struck 42 times, shattering practically every one of his bones. In the region at the time, it wasn't uncommon for torturers to hammer the limbs of the condemned so severely that they would be pushed between the gaps of the wheel in multiple places, creating a mangled mess of blood and bone. So it seems more than likely that this was done to Peter. Throughout this entire ordeal, Peter somehow remained alive, which onlookers believed was because of his pact with the devil. So to finish the job, the executioner sawed off what was left of his limbs, quartering him, and removed his organs. And with that, history's worst serial killer was finally dead. In viewing the story of Peter Nears, it feels obvious that a number of elements have been embellished. However, while it's very common for murderers from history to be reimagined as monsters with supernatural powers in later years, what I find most interesting about Peter's story is that there are countless contemporary ballads, reports, and documents that show all of these ideas were present before and after his execution. There's a wide range of pamphlets detailing Peter's crimes that date back years before his initial capture, let alone his actual arrest and execution. For example, pamphlets from writer Alexander Hawk detail Peter and his gang of bandits' crimes, writing in 1577, several years before Peter's confession, that he had been responsible for more than 400 murders. There are even accounts, such as the ones from writer Jacob Muller published on September 16, 1581, that were written in the days after his execution, providing first-hand descriptions of what happened, as well as countless other pamphlets published at the time, such as those by well-known writers like Basel and Strasbourg. There are also a number of official documents from the time discussing his crimes, confession, and execution, such as his arrest warrant, and dozens of contemporary ballads written both before and after his execution about him. So to be clear, there is a plethora of evidence that Peter Nears was a real person, who really did lead a group of bandits who were responsible for an exceptionally large number of murders. Peter really was captured in 1577, where he confessed to 75 murders, and he really did escape. After which, he continued robbing and murdering, before he was finally captured and executed in 1581. By all accounts, the brutal torture that led to his confession of killing 544 individuals also really did happen as described, and Peter had been claimed to have a similarly high body count years before his own confession. It's impossible to know if Peter really was responsible for as many murders as has been claimed, but I think given the sheer amount of evidence about his criminal activities, at the very least it's likely that he and his gang of outlaws left a trail of bodies over their 15-year rampage that was in the hundreds, cementing his place as one of history's most prolific killers, if not the most prolific killer of all time. Tales of Peter's occult activities, however, while maybe containing some elements of truth to them, are most likely embellishments. People did believe black magic was real back then, and it's not impossible to imagine that a violent criminal, likely suffering from psychopathy or mental illness, believed occult practices could help him achieve his goals. So I'm not ruling out the idea that Peter really did conduct rituals and sacrifices. Whether real or not, if he believed doing so would benefit him, I can believe that he might have done it. However, it seems telling to me that all the early reports of Peter's crimes do not make any mention of black magic, cannibalism, or deals with the devil. These ideas seem to have been added to his story after his initial escape from captivity. The concepts of psychopathy or mental illness didn't exist back then, so supernatural explanations were often used to help understand the actions of violent murderers like Peter. It's far easier to blame the devil than to accept that another person, just like you, could carry out such senseless violence for no reason beyond their own enjoyment of it. After escaping as a well-known murderer with a disturbingly large body count, it seems much more plausible that his story took on a mythical quality, as it was retold in ballads and around fireplaces, with dark and disturbing details being added with each retelling. In essence, he became a medieval boogeyman. For example, there was no mention of Peter's mentor, Steer, practicing occult rituals or teaching them to Peter until after his initial escape in 1577, so it feels like a detail that was added to explain his apparent occult knowledge after his escape, as the stories began including occult activities. It's also worth pointing out that there was a widespread panic at the time over the existence of witches, with many of the dark magic activities of Peter falling perfectly in line with what it was claimed witches were doing. It feels plausible to imagine that the prevalent fears about witchcraft bled into the stories about Peter's violent crimes. Similarly, while blaming supernatural powers for his ability to evade capture and escape from custody might have been logical to people at the time, it seems far more likely that this was simply down to his known mastery of disguises and his skills as a hardened criminal gained from years scheming and hiding. While Peter himself did confess to killing pregnant women and to conducting twisted rituals using fetuses and babies, these admissions were made while being tortured in the most horrific ways imaginable. The sort of brutal torture Peter underwent often led to false confessions, with people desperate to say anything their torturers, namely the church, wanted to hear to make it stop. so I don't think we can put a lot of faith in the accuracy of his own confession. Now, you might be thinking, if that's the case, then how come Peter was captured with the leather pouch filled with infant remains for his rituals? And the simple answer to that is, he probably wasn't. That aspect of the story comes from ballads and retellings that appeared after his death. As far as I'm aware, these are the only accounts that detail any specific elements of how he was captured, with that specific explanation appearing to have originated in a folk song written years later. Though that isn't to say it definitively didn't happen, as I haven't come across any alternate accounts for how Peter was captured before his execution. And we do know for a fact that he was captured and executed. Ultimately, the details surrounding Peter's life and crimes appear to have become muddled over time, due to the blending of folklore with actual historical accounts. Aspects of his story, including the number of victims, were likely exaggerated. But that doesn't detract from the fact that Peter really existed, really was a serial killer, and really did have a huge body count to his name. In fact, there are a number of other stories of other criminals and killers from around the same time as Peter, such as Chrisman Ganipertanga, who historians now believe probably didn't exist, and were likely inspired by the real story of Peter. And with that, our exploration of what could be history's most prolific serial killer comes to a close. I really enjoy taking a look at these historical true crime cases, even if they are much more difficult to verify or to find detailed accounts of. Obviously, I can't go into the same level of depth on cases like this as I can with modern ones, but I think they're fascinating to look at nonetheless. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and drop a comment down below to appease the algorithm gods, and to let me know what you thought about it. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss. February 21st, 1841. A laborer called George Sturgis is traveling to Sydney in the British colony of New South Wales with his boss's livestock. He stops near the Ironstone Bridge, just outside of the small village of Berrima, after spotting a dingo pawing at something in some broken bushes. Intrigued, he approaches to take a closer look, discovering a man lying on his back, with his skull having been smashed in from behind. George hastily alerts the Berrima police, who rush to the scene, soon identifying the man as Kearns Landrigan, a local farm worker. With several severe wounds to the back of his skull, there is no doubt that Kearns has been murdered. As their investigation begins, owner of the Woolpack Inn, John Chalker, comes forward, reporting that 2 days before the body was found, he had served Kearns at his pub alongside another farmer called John Dunleavy. John Dunleavy, it turned out, had recently taken over a farm that had previously belonged to the Mulligan family. Alarmingly, none of the Mulligan family, both parents and their 2 children, had ever been seen again after Dunleavy claimed to purchase the land from them. So the investigators headed over to Dunleavy's farm, where they found bloodstains on his shirt. He even had a wagon that perfectly matched the tire tracks found at the crime scene. Searching the property, they also found Kearns' hat and belt among a large collection of other stolen property. As you can imagine, they arrested him, accusing him of murder. But most shockingly of all, they quickly realized that John Dunleavy didn't even exist. The man they had in custody, claiming to be Dunleavy, was actually a notorious criminal known as John Lynch. Among his many crimes, Lynch had previously been implicated in another murder in 1835, which he had barely managed to avoid being executed for. As they began digging into Lynch's life and history, they soon discovered that he was linked to the murders and disappearances of at least 8 other people, with some of the stolen property found at the farm directly tying him to several open murder investigations. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Lynch remained defiant, insisting he was innocent and confident he would be cleared of all charges. On March 21st, 1842, Lynch stood trial at Berrima Courthouse and was sentenced to hang for the murder of Kearns Landrigan. As the judge condemned him, he noted, "It is now credibly believed, if not actually ascertained, that no less than 9 other individuals have fallen by your murderous hands. How many more have been violently ushered into another world remains unrecorded, save in the dark page of your own memory." Despite this, Lynch continued denying his guilt and made every appeal possible to overturn his sentence. When all avenues had been exhausted and he had no choice but to accept his fate, on the night before his execution, Lynch summoned a priest to his cell and finally confessed to his crimes. This is the story of John Lynch, also known as Born in Ireland in 1813, little is known about John Lynch's life until his conviction for obtaining goods under false pretenses, or more commonly, theft. Lynch was then transported on the convict ship Dunvegan Castle, arriving in New South Wales in 1832. At the time, New South Wales served as a penal colony where British convicts were sentenced to hard labor, normally for 7 years, after which they could choose to settle or return home if they could afford it. Once there, Lynch was assigned to work as a laborer on a number of farms, before falling in with a group of notorious outlaws called bushrangers. Lynch and his group roamed the outback, robbing and stealing, then selling the stolen goods in the surrounding area. During his time as a bushranger, Lynch became friendly with a farmer called John Mulligan, an emancipated convict who regularly helped him by acting as a fence for his stolen goods. In 1835, Lynch was working at the Oldbury Farm in Argyll, run by George Barton, a temperamental alcoholic who had gained ownership of the property after marrying the widowed owner Charlotte Atkinson. Shortly after marrying her, George was ambushed on the road by a masked gang of bushrangers who robbed him of everything he had before leaving him flogged and tied to a post where he was later found. 2 members of Lynch's gang, Watt and Pickering, were apprehended and executed for the crime, but rumors circulated that Lynch was behind the assault due to a personal grudge with his cruel overseer. Not long after, another one of the convict laborers at Oldbury, Thomas Smith, was arrested for stealing a saddle, but released without charges, allegedly because he offered up information about the previous attack. Soon after his release, Smith was found beaten to death and stuffed inside a hollow tree about a mile from the Oldbury Farm's convict huts. Another laborer, Michael Hoy, claimed he had seen Lynch and another worker walking off with Smith and returning covered in blood the night he went missing. With the risk of being sent to the gallows if he was found guilty, Lynch managed to mount a vigorous defense at his trial and effectively discredited Hoy during cross-examination, convincing the jury that Hoy himself actually had motive to kill Smith and was responsible. George Burton was called to testify, but showed up blind drunk and ended up getting fined himself, unable to provide any evidence for or against the accused convict laborers in his employment. Ultimately, the jury found Lynch and his accomplice not guilty and acquitted them both. Following the trial, with other charges still pending against the 2 men, they were sent to Hyde Park Barracks for further investigation. During his years in custody at the barracks, Lynch was stabbed in an altercation with 3 fellow inmates who attacked him during his sleep. The 3 men were tried and convicted for the crime, initially being sentenced to death, though thankfully their sentence was ultimately commuted, given Lynch years later admitted that he had stabbed himself and blamed the men out of revenge. At some point in 1841, Lynch left the barracks, with conflicting reports stating that he was either sent to return to his previous role as a convict laborer in Berrima, or that he escaped custody and fled. Whatever the reasoning, Lynch did return to Berrima, heading over to Mulligan's farm where he had supposedly left a range of stolen goods. According to Lynch, John Mulligan sold the goods, but refused to give Lynch his owed share of the sales. Swearing to himself he would return and seek vengeance, Lynch set his sights on his old employer, Oldbury Farm. Sneaking onto the farm, Lynch stole 8 bullocks and a wagon and began driving towards Sydney, planning to sell them. On his journey, he encountered a man called Edmund Ireland and a young Aboriginal boy who were transporting cattle and a wagon full of goods belonging to a man called Thomas Cowper to Sydney as well. Introducing himself under the false name Snelling, the duo agreed to travel alongside Lynch for added safety, though they would soon learn that being in Lynch's company was anything but safe. Not long into their journey, Lynch reached the conclusion that he could make significantly more profit if he killed Ireland and took all of his goods to sell instead of the stolen 8 bullocks. At night, as the group stopped to rest, Lynch laid awake and asked God for guidance on what to do next. Though he didn't specify if God answered him, by morning he had hatched his plan. As the Aboriginal boy woke, Lynch asked him to help gather the livestock. Happy to help, the boy hurried into the nearby scrub to gather up the animals, giving Lynch the opportunity to sneak up behind him and deliver a deadly blow to the back of his head with a tomahawk. In Lynch's own words, all it needed to kill him was just one tap with the tomahawk. He dropped like a log of wood. Lynch then returned to the camp where Ireland was preparing breakfast, calmly explaining that the boy had gone off to search for the bullocks so they should eat without him. As Ireland began serving food, he turned his back to Lynch, allowing him to smash his head with the same tomahawk. With Ireland lying dead and bloody at his feet, Lynch then sat down and ate the breakfast he had just cooked. When finished, he dragged their bodies about 100 yards into the bush, placed them in a rocky crevice, and covered them with stones. Lynch released his original 8 bullocks, sending them back in the direction of Oldbury Farm. and took over Ireland's herd himself, given they were loaded with goods to sell. Calm and collected, convinced God was watching over him, Lynch stayed at the camp for a further 2 days, despite the 2 bodies being buried right beside it. On the second day, 2 men transporting their own group of horses, Laga and Lee, arrived and joined him, spending the night eating, drinking, and singing, unaware of what Lynch had done. According to Lynch, he was initially planning to kill the men and steal their goods too, but because he had enjoyed their company so much, he decided against it. The next morning, Lynch and his 2 new companions decided to continue their journey together. As they neared the outskirts of Sydney, the 2 new companions headed on without him. Soon after, a man rode up beside him and demanded to know why Lynch was in possession of his animals and his goods. This man was Thomas Cowper. Thinking fast, Lynch claimed that Ireland had been injured, and that he had taken over to help complete the journey, while the Aboriginal boy assisted in bringing Ireland back home. Relieved, Cowper thanked the man who had murdered his employees and stolen his goods, accepting Lynch's offer to continue taking the load to Sydney while he went back himself to check on Ireland and the boy. They agreed they would meet in town in a few days' time, and Cowper rode off. Lynch then rode non-stop through the night, ensuring he reached Sydney way ahead of schedule. Making sure he wouldn't be tied to the sale of the goods, Lynch paid a drunkard to sell them on his behalf, planning to claim the goods had been stolen from him if authorities ever questioned him. When Lynch failed to meet him as planned, Cowper realized he had been deceived and placed advertisements seeking information about the missing wagon and its cargo. His search led him to a horse's bridle and some bacon that had been sold, but the trail went cold at that point. Meanwhile, Lynch had pocketed the money from the sales and hurried out of town with the cart and bullocks. As he neared the location he had murdered Ireland and the Aboriginal boy, he spotted a father and son, William Fraser and his son William Jr. The pair were heading to Berrima with cargo for Samuel Bawtry, so Lynch began traveling the roads with them, joining another camp with 2 married couples at Bargo Brush. The moment Lynch settled down to sleep, a police constable rode into their camp, inquiring if anyone had seen the stolen wagon and bullocks that Lynch was riding with. For some reason, Fraser told the officer he hadn't seen it and he knew nothing about it. Failing to spot Lynch, the officer rode off, satisfied. Shocked, Lynch saw it as another sign that God was on his side, later describing it as a miracle. Despite the fact that Fraser had just saved his life, as Lynch lay on the ground, he again spoke to God, who he claims informed him that he needed to get rid of the Cowper's bullocks and wagon, before killing the Fraser family and taking their wagon and horses for himself. So during the night, Lynch quietly set the bullocks free, reporting them missing the next morning to the Frasers. Asking for their help to hide his wagon till he could return with more animals, the Frasers assisted him, completely unaware of Lynch's true intentions. After concealing the wagon as best they could, the Frasers offered to give Lynch a lift. After a day of traveling, they set up camp for the night, and in the morning, Lynch carried out a near-identical plan to his first murderous scheme. He lured William Jr. out to help look for the horses, before approaching him from behind and striking him in the back of the head with a single blow from his tomahawk. Returning to the camp, Lynch told his father that his son was out looking for the horses. Then, Lynch signaled that he could see his son approaching, causing Fraser to turn around. As soon as he did, Lynch struck him in the back of the head with his tomahawk, instantly killing him. Thanking God for his guidance and for overseeing the successful murders, Lynch then dragged both bodies into the bush, retrieved a spade, and buried them in shallow graves. The following morning he set off toward the nearby Mulligan farm. Whether his intent was to sell his stolen goods or to settle an old grudge is unknown. Samuel Bawtry, who the Frasers were working for, initiated a search for information regarding them and his missing cargo, which led to the discovery of Cowper's cart, found hidden in the bush. It didn't take long for authorities to connect the thefts from both Cowper and Bawtry, leading to the belief that the Frasers, along with Edmund Ireland and the unnamed Aboriginal boy, had all been robbed and likely murdered by the same person. Their investigations led to a description of their suspect, Lynch, but by chance, or perhaps as Lynch would claim, divine intervention, he had used the name Snelling several times on his journey, and a man called Snelling just so happened to also meet the description. Snelling was arrested, alongside 2 other men called Bailey and Brown, who had actually encountered Lynch on his journey, giving Lynch even more time to evade capture or identification. Bridget Mulligan was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of their farmhouse when she spotted Lynch approaching. Knowing full well who he was, Bridget questioned where he got the horses and wagon he had presumably come to try and sell to her husband, John. Instead, Lynch told her that he had actually come to collect the £30 that John owed him for the stolen goods from before. With John coming home soon, Lynch walked over to the nearby Black Horse Inn to buy some rum, thinking that a few drinks might help convince John to pay what he supposedly owed. Little did John know, Lynch had already made up his mind about what was going to happen that day. If John Mulligan didn't pay him the £30, he was going to kill him and his entire family. When he returned, John and Bridget were waiting for him together on the porch. Sitting and joining them, Lynch opened the rum and the three of them drank and chatted into the evening. But when Lynch tried to bring up the money owed to him again, and John attempted to reason and negotiate, Lynch made his decision. The Mulligan family had to die. First, he lured their teenage son Johnny out into the woods under the guise of cutting wood for the fire, given it was a chilly night. Once out of sight, he struck the boy in the back of the head with his tomahawk, killing him. When he returned to the house, he told Bridget that Johnny was setting his horses up in the paddock. But as time passed and her son didn't return, Bridget began to grow worried. Hearing the commotion as they called out to Johnny with no response, John Sr. grabbed his gun and headed out to look for him. But this was a huge mistake, as Lynch followed him towards the bushes and, wasting no time, hit the armed man in the back of the head with his tomahawk, killing him too. A moment later, he noticed Bridget approaching where her son's body was. Needing to act fast, Lynch hurried over and tripped her, knocking her to the ground. As she lay helpless, he raised his tomahawk and swung it down at her, killing her too. Finally, having killed the rest of the family, Lynch moved into the house, axe in his hand, to find their 14-year-old daughter Mary. As he crept inside the building, floorboards creaking beneath his boots, he found the young girl standing in the kitchen, trembling as she clung to a butcher's knife after seeing what he'd just done to her mother. According to Lynch, Mary stood frozen behind a table, ignoring his demands for her to drop the knife. Unable to even speak due to fear of the blood-soaked murderer, Lynch easily disarmed her, telling her he didn't want to kill her, but he had no choice after what she'd seen. Then, Lynch proceeded to sexually assault her, before telling her to get on her knees and pray. When Mary obliged, he walked behind her, telling her, "Life is full of trouble and you'll be better off dead," before he hit her in the back of the head with his tomahawk. Lynch then gathered up the bodies of the Mulligan family, piled them up outside, and set them on fire. In his own words, they burnt like bags of fat. Alongside the bodies, Lynch burnt all of the family's possessions, before burying the remains nearby. He then arranged for an advertisement in the Sydney Gazette, which claimed Bridget had left home without her husband's consent, taking all his money, and so he needed to sell the farm. Still posing as John Mulligan, he sent letters to creditors, telling them he had sold the farm's lease to a man named John Dunleavy for £700, forging a deed. With everything in place, Lynch took over the new identity of John Dunleavy. And to his surprise, nobody questioned any of it. Nobody even came looking for the Mulligans. Once again, he took it as proof that God was protecting and watching over him. With this divine protection, he was free to do anything and everything he wanted. Soon, he hired the Barnetts, a married couple, to manage the farm while he handled trips to sell the produce. Although the Barnetts had previously known Lynch by his real name, they were instructed to call him Dunleavy. Lynch later confessed that he had chosen them because he considered them to be naive and believed he would be safe with them. And for the next 6 months, he lived a normal life under this new identity, earning the trust of his workers and creditors, and gaining a reputation as a skilled and kind-hearted farmer. Yet, as you already know, Lynch's murder spree had not stopped yet, and it would be his next murder that would be his undoing. While returning from Sydney, Lynch encountered Kearns Landrigan and offered him a job building fences on the farm. Exactly what happened after that is unclear, but for one reason or another, Lynch changed his mind about Kearns and decided he needed to die. The two men had dinner together at the Woolpack Inn, where multiple people, including the pub owner, recognized them. Later, he drove Kearns to Ironside Bridge and set up camp. As they talked and laughed, Lynch crept up behind him and struck him in the back of his head with the tomahawk. This time, the blow didn't kill him instantly. It took several more blows to the back of the head for him to die. Lynch then robbed him, taking his money and a handful of items, and returned to his farm. Unlike his previous murders, he left multiple witnesses and a range of incriminating evidence. He didn't even bother to create an alibi for Kearns' whereabouts, despite being seen with him the day he disappeared. According to Lynch, by this point he was so convinced of his divine protection that he no longer saw the need. He was never going to be caught. But as you know from the opening of this video, he could not have been more wrong. Kearns' body was found on the morning of February 21st by a laborer named George Sturgis, who noticed a dingo pawing at some damaged bushes. Finding the body, he immediately contacted local law enforcement, who arrived to investigate and discovered cart tracks at the scene. Especially notable because one wheel had seized, leaving a distinct mark. The body was taken to the local morgue, and authorities issued a call for anyone who could identify it. John Chalker, who operated the Woolpack Inn along the trail and was familiar with most travelers in the area, came forward. He recognized Landrigan and informed the police that the deceased man had recently stopped by his pub for a meal, accompanied by John Dunleavy, where he spoke about starting a new job for Dunleavy. As a result, the police went to the former Mulligan farm to arrest Dunleavy, where they noticed blood on Lynch's shirt, which Lynch claimed was from an insect bite. Meanwhile, an officer spotted a cart on the property and, upon inspection, found that its track width matched the cart tracks at the murder scene, including the distinctive stuck wheel. The final piece of evidence confirming their suspicions was a hat discovered in the house, which was identified as belonging to Kearns as he had been wearing it when he visited the Woolpack Inn. Lynch's misfortunes continued when he was imprisoned in Berrima. During a search of the Mulligan farm, authorities uncovered not only a belt, which Kearns' brother identified as his, but also items reported stolen from the wagons belonging to both Cowper and Bawtrey. It didn't take long for police to identify Dunleavy as John Lynch, with the old police chief instantly recognizing him from his previous murder trial. As he was formally charged with the murder of Kearns Landrigan, authorities found a number of witnesses indicating he had been seen traveling with Ireland and the Aboriginal boy, and the Fraser father and son, before they were seemingly robbed and murdered. Suspecting he had murdered the Mulligan family and stolen their farm too, police began excavating the farm in search of bodies. Before long, they uncovered human bones, including teeth, buried among the potatoes, which Lynch claimed could not be proven to belong to the Mulligans. Thomas Cowper was called to examine the stolen loot found at the Mulligan farm, and was able to confirm that a shotgun and a number of clothing items were his property and stolen from the wagon Ireland was driving. Seeing Lynch at the jail, Cowper instantly identified him as the man he'd seen driving the wagon, resulting in Lynch shouting abuse at him and having to be restrained. To pay for his defense, Lynch tried to claim his various belongings and land could be sold on his behalf, but the courts denied his request, given the farm and the valuables he wanted to sell were items alleged to be stolen from the very people Lynch was accused of murdering. And so, on March 21, 1842, the trial of John Lynch began for the murder of Kearns Landrigan. The trial lasted for 12 hours and drew a large crowd. Throughout it, Lynch cross-examined the multiple witnesses himself, trying to undermine their credibility, presumably hoping for a repeat of his last murder trial where he was ultimately acquitted. He argued that the belt had been planted in his home by Kearns' brother, and claimed that the hat was his own, but when he tried it on in court, it was evident that it was too large for him. Lynch maintained that Kearns had left him on the road after stating he had misplaced his money, promising to return to the farm after searching for it. He also claimed to have purchased the farm from the Mulligans using an inheritance sent from family back in Ireland. Despite what observers described as a convincing performance by Lynch, the jury found him guilty. 2 days later, the judge delivered the following speech as he sentenced him to death. "John Lynch, the trade in blood which has so long marked your career is at last terminated, not by any sense of remorse or the sating of any appetite for slaughter on your part, but by the energy of a few zealous spirits. It is now credibly believed, if not actually ascertained, that no less than 9 other individuals have fallen by your murderous hands. How many more have been violently ushered into another world remains unrecorded, save in the dark page of your own memory. By your own confession it is admitted that as late as 1835 justice was invoked on your head for a frightful murder committed in this immediate neighborhood. Your unlucky escape on that occasion has, it would seem, whetted your tigrine relish for human gore, but at length you have fallen into toils from which you cannot escape. The wily cunning, the artful devices, the blustering impudence which have so long sustained you in the pursuit of a lawless life, can no longer serve your turn. The sentence of the law is that you be taken hence to the place from whence you came, when you are to be taken to such place, on such day, as His Excellency the Governor shall appoint, and be hanged by the neck till you are dead, and may the Lord have mercy on your soul." Surprisingly, Lynch adamantly and emotionally pled for the court not to punish his employees, the Barnetts, who were being held in custody, for any crimes, as anything he had been accused of occurred before they started working at the farm for him. When the press discovered that George Barton's drunkenness had been a key factor in Lynch being acquitted at his previous trial, thus allowing him to commit his spree of murders. They published endless scathing articles about him, making out he was at least partially responsible for what Lynch went on to do. Public sympathy grew for the surviving members of the Fraser family, which included a widow, 2 daughters, and a young son. To assist them in their time of need, a public subscription was organized, ultimately raising over £115 for them. Despite only being convicted of 1 murder, the suspects that were being held in respect to several of the other cases were all released after Lynch's trial, with police confident in the evidence tying Lynch to every one of them. Throughout his arrest and trial, however, Lynch never wavered in his claim that he was innocent, attempting to explore every avenue for a retrial once he was convicted, still convinced that God was going to protect him from death. Eventually, though, on the day before his execution, realizing God was not going to intervene and rescue him, Lynch finally confessed to all his crimes. He summoned Reverend Summers, telling him about every person he had murdered, and giving details to help find the missing bodies. He was even taken to the Mulligan farm to show the police where he had buried the bodies, even though they had already located the remains. On April 22, 1842, John Lynch was taken to the gallows at Berrima jail and executed. Observers claimed he showed no fear of death and showed no sign of remorse for his actions. Soon after his death, the bodies of the Frasers were discovered exactly where Lynch claimed he had buried them, allowing them to be interred in the All Saints Anglican churchyard. It took almost another month for authorities to locate the bodies of Edmund Ireland and the unnamed Aboriginal boy, despite them also being exactly where Lynch had revealed they were. Surprisingly, it took until 2019 for a plaque in the All Saints Anglican churchyard in Berrima to be erected, commemorating the graves of the 6 local victims. A small, tranquil village with a population of around 600, which was less than half of that at the time of Lynch's crimes. The plaque is an odd reminder that Berrima, filled with arts and crafts shops, a museum, and even Australia's oldest hotel, holds a dark past as the hunting ground of Australia's earliest known serial killer. John Lynch was known to carry his tomahawk with him at all times. While a firearm might have been a more practical weapon for his crimes, Lynch chose to use the same tomahawk to murder all 9 of his confirmed victims, earning him the nickname, the Berrima Axe Murderer, in the press at the time. And with that, our exploration of this historical serial killer case comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and drop a comment down below to help it in the algorithm. If you found this case interesting and know of any other historical or modern true crime cases you think would be just as interesting to see me explore on the channel, feel free to let me know down below. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss. In the 1800s, the concept of psychopathy, of serial killers, of monsters hiding in plain sight, had not yet been developed. Scientists still believed that the way you looked, the shape of your brain, the way you presented yourself, could reveal if you were a violent person or not. But as we know now, the most prolific and proficient monsters tend to hide behind smiles, charm, and the appearance of normality. No case defines these conflicting, shifting ideas around killers in 1800s America more than this one. July 6, 1870. A man is heading to work in Binghamton, New York, crossing the bridge over the Shenango River, when something catches his eye. Upstream, he spies an unfamiliar object bobbing in the water, snagged on a rock. Whatever it is, it doesn't look like it belongs there, so the man moves closer to inspect it. But as he nears the object, he realizes that it's a piece of clothing in the water, worn by a dead man lying face down in the shallow part of the river. With the help of a boat, he tows the body to shore and quickly alerts the sheriff. Immediately realizing that the man had drowned, he suspects that the body is linked to a recent shocking murder that had gripped the town. Before long, a crowd of nearly 200 residents gathers around to see the body. As the crowd gather, the man decides to investigate another strange object he had spotted in the river earlier. Although he had initially ignored it, now that he had discovered the body, he felt an overwhelming urge to check it out. Rowing the boat out with some help, the man reached the stationary object in the river, quickly realizing that he had discovered a second dead body. With this second body, the crowd believed they knew what had happened. Recently, 3 men had broken into the Halbert Brothers dry goods store and murdered a night guard, Frederick Merrick, before fleeing towards the river. The crowd assumed that the bodies belonged to 2 of these men, who had both drowned while trying to make an escape. Swollen from the water, the bodies were pulled from the river and laid out for the townspeople to see. with one of the men having an eye gouged out by the hook used to retrieve him. Convinced that justice had been served, the crowd cheered, believing the river had taken their lives for taking the life of one of their own. The bodies were taken to the undertaker for photographs and moved to the courthouse for embalming, with their clothing being thoroughly searched for anything that might help identify them. But one key question remained. If these were the burglars, then where was their third accomplice? And the third criminal, who would soon be apprehended and identified as Edward Howard Roloff, was about to turn this seemingly simple case of a burglary gone wrong into something much more complicated and much, much darker. Because Roloff, it would turn out, was not only a serial murderer, but one of America's most intellectually intriguing criminals. So much so, he would later become known as the Genius Killer. Scientists were so fascinated with Roloff, whose brain is one of the largest ever measured, that they studied his brain for decades after his death, trying to uncover anomalies and secrets within it that might help explain his malevolent nature. Roloff's combination of intelligence, charm, and violent impulses made his case particularly compelling, turning him into the first American murderer to be studied in scientific journals, sparking debates among neuroscientists about whether his brain, rather than his personal choices, were responsible for his crimes. So in this week's video, let's take a look at the life, crimes, and aftermath of Edward Roloff, the Genius Killer. In the early hours of Wednesday morning, 3 burglars broke into Halbert's, waking the 2 clerks who were sleeping there as night guards. They attempted to use chloroform to keep the store employees asleep during the robbery, but their plan failed when one of them accidentally made a noise, waking the clerks. Frederick Merrick, one of the clerks, initially tried to shoot at the intruders with a pistol he had under his pillow, but the gun malfunctioned. In response, he hurled a stool at the intruders to try and scare them off. Gilbert Burrows, the other clerk, managed to catch one of the intruders and started beating him. But then, the third intruder pulled out a gun and fired a warning shot into the air. Burrows backed off, but Merrick continued attacking the intruders. So the third man aimed his gun at his head and fired, killing him instantly. As the burglars fled the scene, Burrows hurried out to get the police and alert them to what had happened. A young girl reported seeing 2 men leaving the store through the back door towards the river, but was unable to see if they got into a boat or jumped into the water. Another woman claimed to have seen 3 men enter the river, and she was right. The robbers missed the boat that was supposed to take them across the Chenango River and were forced to swim instead. 2 of them, exhausted and unable to fight the strong current, drowned during the attempt. The third managed to swim across, leaving behind his pair of leather boots. After Burrows raised the alarm, the Binghamton police quickly organized patrols and began rounding up anyone who appeared suspicious. The next morning, a stranger drew attention to himself by refusing to identify himself when approached at the local railroad station. Instead, he bolted across the train tracks and hid in the outhouse of a nearby farm, where he was eventually apprehended and placed in jail alongside 2 other suspects. The sheriff took the 3 potential suspects, including the unknown stranger, to view the 2 bodies, hoping to see some sort of reaction that would reveal they knew the dead men. But all 3 claimed not to recognize the dead men, and their behavior seemed to reveal no signs of deception. The stranger, in particular, remained calm and stoic as he examined the corpses. Initially, he gave his name to the grand jury as Charles Augustus, but he later changed it to George Williams, which raised suspicions about him, but didn't provide any definitive link towards the murder of the night clerk. The stranger claimed to be a 52-year-old lawyer, and the sheriff saw no reason to keep him detained. That is, until an onlooker, Judge Ransom Balcom, recognized him and shouted out, "You are Edward H. Roloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845. Roloff admitted his true identity when pressed, but offered a reasonable excuse for his lie. He knew that being a stranger in town during a murder investigation would make him a suspect given his past, so he was trying to save them from wasting their time focusing on him. His charm and deception worked, and he was allowed to go free, at least for now. The detectives knew they needed to identify the burglars if they had any hopes of locating their potential third accomplice. Examining the items found in their pockets, they discovered 6 keys, a letter addressed to someone named Henry Wilson, train tickets to Batavia, and a scrap of paper bearing the name and address of a lawyer in Brooklyn called William Thornton. One of the two men also had a well-worn book on him, called the Book of Fate, that claimed it could help you predict the future by channeling energy through mysterious dots and lines. Also known as Napoleon's Oraculum, legend claimed this book had been pillaged from an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb by a French expedition in 1801. Supposedly, this book was then translated and used by Napoleon to guide all of his decisions, before being discovered in his cabinet of curiosities after his defeat in 1813. But it wasn't any of these items that initially helped the detectives in their investigation. Instead, it was the pair of leather shoes that had been found, custom-made for a deformed left foot. But neither of the two dead men had a deformed left foot, ruling them out as the owners of the shoes. Not long after Roloff had already been let free and left town, someone recalled a peculiar detail about him. He was missing his big toe and had several unusual bumps on his feet. Assuming the custom shoes must have belonged to him, a deputy was sent to locate Roloff and managed to catch up with him on his journey out of Binghamton. The deputy brought Roloff back to town, and like a twisted retelling of Cinderella, he was made to try on the shoes, and lo and behold, they fit him perfectly. Then, they discovered a train ticket in his pocket to Batavia, just like the two deceased burglars. Yet, despite the fact that circumstantial evidence was often used in courts at the time, these two potentially coincidental pieces of evidence were not deemed strong enough to guarantee a murder conviction for Roloff. So the detectives headed out to Brooklyn to visit William Thornton, the lawyer whose name had been found on the scrap of paper. Thornton immediately recognized one of the dead burglars in the photographs they showed him as Billy Dexter, though he didn't recognize the other man. With Dexter's address, the detectives headed to his house, where a woman confirmed his identity. When they showed her a picture of Roloff, the woman also recognized him as an associate, though she identified him as Edward Howard. So using a key found in Roloff's clothes, convinced he was involved, they headed over to his house and entered to find a trove of more circumstantial evidence, including burglary tools and items that connected him with the two dead men, allowing them to identify the second burglar as Albert Jarvis. They also discovered an extensive manuscript Roloff had been working on. As it turned out, Jarvis had first met Roloff as a young boy when his father worked as a jailer in the prison Roloff was an inmate in. Having formed a bond, Roloff had then seemingly influenced Jarvis and led him down a path of crime, using his intelligence and charisma to easily persuade the young man to join his criminal schemes. With all these connections now established, the case against Roloff and his involvement in the murder was becoming something the authorities could seriously hope to gain a conviction in. And with their eyes on Roloff, his dark past was about to be revealed, making it easy to believe that he was the mastermind behind the failed burglary and likely had killed the clerk himself. It seemed clear to everyone that this was not the first time Roloff had taken a life. Yet in his previous cases, he had always managed to evade justice. So this time, the detectives were determined to hold him accountable for what he'd done. So District Attorney Peter Hopkins began building the case against him, starting with his dark and ominous history. Born in 1821 in New Brunswick, Canada, John Edward Howard Rulofson was the eldest of three brothers, and had a knack for charming others with his gentle demeanor and exceptional intelligence. After his father passed away in 1827, his mother Priscilla was left to care for their three sons, resulting in financial hardship. From a young age, Roloff immersed himself in books, reading late into the night until his mother would extinguish his lamp. His interest in religion was more academic than spiritual. He was captivated by the Bible and studied the Greek Testament, viewing languages as forms of art. Despite this, the family's financial struggles prevented Roloff from pursuing higher education, forcing him to start working as a clerk in a dry goods store by the time he was 16. It was there that Roloff's criminal activities began. A series of fires, suspected to be arson, were believed to be attempts to conceal thefts of inventory. Roloff was eventually caught wearing a suit made from stolen goods and was convicted of embezzlement, serving a 2-year prison sentence. But upon his release, rather than learning or repenting for his petty crimes, Roloff simply adopted a new identity, emigrated to the United States, and re-entered society. Roloff sought to educate himself in a variety of fields, albeit with mixed success. He dabbled as a physician, tried his hand as an investor and a teacher, and even ventured into the then popular field of phrenology, an early form of psychology in the 19th century. Though ironically, phrenology would later be used against him as a prime example of its theories. A lot of phrenology was based around analyzing an individual's physical appearance to understand their character. For example, bumps and depressions on a person's skull would be studied to assess the functioning of different brain areas. At the time, the brain was thought to be divided into 35 distinct organs, each corresponding to traits such as cautiousness or adhesiveness, with the size of this supposed organ believed to indicate strength of that trait. But most significantly, Roloff pursued a path as a philologist, a discipline that focused on the study of language structure, word origins, and their similarities across different languages. Self-taught in numerous languages such as Latin and Greek, Roloff was convinced that uncovering the origins of language would unlock fundamental truths about human nature and existence. He compiled his work into a book called Method in the Formation of Language, which he offered for sale at the insane price of $500,000, convinced its contents would cement his place in history as one of the most brilliant minds of all time. Unsurprisingly, nobody purchased it. This alone should be enough to show you the extent of Roloff's arrogance and inflated sense of self-worth. But to make sure it was clear to everyone he met just how intelligent and superior he was, he would drop literary references and phrases into every conversation he had to try and impress those around him. After finding employment on the Erie Canal, Roloff caught the attention of Will Shutt, who invited him to visit his home. When Roloff arrived at the Shutt farm in Dryden, New York, in mid-1842, he presented himself as an impressive individual, fluent in several languages, and he soon secured a position as a local schoolteacher. Among his students was the teenage Harriet Shutt, who was captivated by the learned man. She even followed him to Ithaca when he became an apprentice to a botanical doctor, learning herbal medicine. But Roloff's behavior was erratic and unpredictable, exhibiting extreme jealousy towards any men that interacted with her. And soon, the Shutt family began to resent and distrust Roloff, with his changing demeanor, inflated ego, and mistreatment of their daughter creating a wedge between them. The timeline of when Roloff's darker traits first appeared remains unclear. Whether his volatile temper and inclination toward violence were evident before the marriage is uncertain, but the couple wed on December 31st, 1843, and in April 1845, the Roloffs welcomed their daughter Priscilla, named in honor of Roloff's mother. Despite his self-professed status as a genius, success seemed to evade Roloff, but his narcissism could never accept that he was poor and unsuccessful because of his own actions. So he soon began to believe that the cause of his problems was his family. And just 2 months later, both Harriet and the baby mysteriously disappeared. Soon after their marriage, Roloff moved Harriet 10 miles away from her family farm to a converted store in Lansing. There, he established himself as a well-regarded botanical physician and gained a reputation as a scholar. A month prior to his family vanishing, in May of that year, Will Shutt was in a desperate situation. His wife and their newborn daughter were gravely ill from a bacterial infection. So he urgently pled with Roloff to use his herbal remedies to save them. Despite the resentment and issues between Roloff and the Shutt family, he reluctantly agreed to assist. But after Roloff attended to them, their conditions seemed to worsen, and by June, both mother and child had died. Given Roloff was known to dislike Will and the Shutt family, some speculated that he may have poisoned Amelia and her baby out of spite. However, devastated by his loss, Will simply believed their deaths were the result of their illness, at least at the time. There was no way a respected scholar could commit such a heinous act. Was there? While this incident was suspicious, what happened next was downright disturbing. A mere 2 weeks after Amelia and her child's funeral, Roloff's own wife and daughter mysteriously vanished. Roloff explained their absence by claiming that Harriet and Priscilla were traveling, though their purported location varied frequently. Harriet was last seen on June 23rd, borrowing soap from a neighbor where she mentioned nothing about leaving or going anywhere. Later that day, a young girl who visited the home reported no signs that Harriet and Priscilla were intending to go anywhere. That evening, neighbors heard commotion from the Roloff household, though it would be years before Roloff revealed what truly had happened that night. According to him, he and Harriet had had a heated argument about their future, with Roloff wanting to move to Ohio, where he had been offered a prestigious position leading an academy, while Harriet wanted to stay near her family, especially as her brother was still grieving. As the argument escalated, Roloff struck his wife in the head with a pestle he used for crushing medicines, fracturing her skull and killing her. To stop his daughter Priscilla from crying, he gave her a narcotic. According to himself in later interviews, he spent the entire night brooding on his bed and contemplating suicide, but ultimately decided against it, believing that ending his life would deprive the world of his genius. Instead, he borrowed a horse and cart from a neighbor, placed Harriet and Priscilla's bodies in a large chest to transport them along the lakeshore, rowed out to deep water in a boat, and discarded the weighted bodies overboard. It's worth noting, Roloff never actually mentioned what happened to his baby after giving her the narcotic to stop crying. but given she vanished that same night, it's safe to assume she suffered the same fate as her mother. But nobody was aware of this at the time. To the rest of the world, Roloff offered various explanations of how and why Harriet had disappeared, suggesting she left town on her own. Not long after, Roloff gathered up his books and manuscript, telling his neighbors he was going on an extended trip. It wasn't until weeks later that curious neighbors entered the Roloff home to find evidence suggesting Harriet had never planned to suddenly leave with her baby, such as the skirt she was wearing the last day she was seen being found discarded on the floor. After nearly a month more had passed, an official investigation into their disappearances finally began, and by then Roloff had vanished himself, living under a new identity, in a new town where nobody knew anything about his dark deeds. With the neighbors believing Roloff had likely murdered his wife and child, they prepared to form a posse to track him down when suddenly, Roloff returned to town acting as if nothing were amiss. When questioned about Harriet and Priscilla, Roloff calmly claimed they were in the Lake region, appearing genuinely surprised that people were openly accusing him of murder. Harriet's brothers, Ephraim and William Schutt, were sitting in a store in Ithaca on a sweltering late summer day when Roloff unexpectedly walked in. The brothers stared at him in shock. "Where have you been?" William asked pointedly. "Between the lakes," Roloff replied calmly. "And where are your wife and child?" Ephraim pressed. Roloff simply smiled and repeated, "Between the lakes." Harriet's brothers demanded that he prove his story was true and take them to see his sister. On the way to Ohio, however, Roloff managed to slip away and escape. As a result, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and it didn't take long for him to be found, brought back to Ithaca, and imprisoned. Convinced he had murdered his wife and daughter, officials offered a reward for the discovery of their bodies, with the district attorney preparing to prosecute him. Roloff's trial began in early 1846, but with no bodies despite searches of Lake Shuga, proving murder was difficult. So instead, the prosecution used Harriet's disappearance as grounds for the lesser charge of abduction. Well-versed in legal matters, Roloff fought fiercely to have the case dismissed before it reached the courtroom, but his attempts ultimately failed, forcing him to go to trial. Even though the only evidence they had was speculative, many jurors were already convinced of Roloff's guilt when the trial began, and he was ultimately convicted of abduction and sentenced to 10 years in Auburn prison. During his 10-year imprisonment, Roloff made the most of his time by learning new skills and acquiring knowledge that would later aid him in his cons. But his imprisonment did little to quell the anger of those who wanted to see him hanged for murder, with the search for Harriet and Priscilla's bodies continuing. On the very day Roloff was set to be released in 1856, another warrant was issued for his arrest on suspicion of murdering his wife. Roloff's defense team argued that this constituted double jeopardy, leading the district attorney to drop the charge of Harriet's murder and replace it with one for the murder of Priscilla. Maintaining his innocence, Roloff and his attorneys successfully requested a change of venue, moving the new trial to Owego, Tioga County, New York, hoping for impartiality. During his time in prison, authorities had tried desperately to gather evidence against him, tracing his movements after he left his home that fateful night. The trunks he had taken with him eventually turned up in Chicago, where they were held by people that Roloff owed money to. Among the items inside them, the authorities had discovered baby clothing, adding to their growing suspicions. With scant evidence, the case against him was largely built around his strange behavior, such as his pattern of lies, his contradictory stories, and his use of aliases. The fact that he failed to provide any evidence that his wife and child were living where he claimed them to be, and that no sign or indication they were alive was ever discovered during his 10-year imprisonment, also strengthened the case against him. In his second trial, the judge warned the jury that the mere disappearance was not enough to conclude a person had been murdered, emphasizing that it was possible that Roloff's wife and child had left on their own and made themselves difficult to locate. Keep in mind, with no cameras, phones, or credit cards back then, it was much easier for a person to disappear if they wanted to. Roloff and his attorneys leaned heavily on this argument, trying to use the lack of evidence for murder to win the trial. But despite this, Roloff finally found himself convicted of murder. However, Roloff was well versed in the legal complexities of his conviction and knew he had grounds for an appeal. When the panel of judges reviewed his case, they faced a critical question. Could someone be convicted of murder without a body? A question that remains a contentious legal issue even today. The prosecutor argued that the circumstantial evidence was enough to support a guilty verdict, regardless of the lack of a body. His argument seemed to win over the other judges, who upheld Roloff's conviction as he remained in prison awaiting sentencing. During this time, Roloff struck up a relationship with a young boy who would later play a crucial role in his life, Albert Jarvis, the son of the jailer. Just 16, Jarvis's parents saw no harm in allowing the charming Roloff to tutor him in Latin and Greek. Regardless of his criminal record, he was still a well-regarded scholar, and they viewed his crimes as isolated incidents that posed no threat to their son. But sadly, they had drastically underestimated Roloff's manipulative nature. Spending hours with Roloff, the impressionable young Jarvis began to see him as a father figure. Roloff even won over his parents, offering to write a biography for the father, and gaining the sympathy of the mother who refused to believe that such a kind, intelligent man could be a murderer, with rumors even suggesting she had fallen in love with him. So in 1857, when Roloff managed to escape the prison by breaking free from 8 locks and a chain around his ankle, it isn't hard to speculate who might have helped him. A $500 reward was immediately offered for his capture, with detailed descriptions of his appearance circulated throughout the country, describing him as a learned murderer, with a thick neck and a large head who may be wearing a disguise. A local newspaper reporter made the claim that a visitor to the jail had given Roloff a significant amount of money to assist him, a fact later confirmed by Jarvis, and leading to the dismissal of his father from his position. Despite the reward growing to over $1,000 for his capture, Roloff remained at large, committing a series of robberies to fund his life on the run. Roloff eventually moved westward to Ohio, but he couldn't run fast enough to escape his own reward notice. As a result, he was recognized by a farmer from the description, who gathered a group of men, including a constable, to apprehend him. Catching him by surprise, Roloff tried to talk his way out of the situation, but nothing he could say was compelling enough to deter them from claiming the reward. The group decided that even if they had the wrong man as Roloff claimed, it was better to mistakenly capture an innocent man than to let a guilty one escape. Returned to the sheriff in Ithaca, Roloff was formally identified and placed back in his former prison cell, albeit with new and more robust locks. With Roloff still trying to challenge his murder conviction, the prosecutor decided to shift to a case with bodies that they could perhaps prove to secure Roloff's imprisonment once and for all: the deaths of his sister-in-law, Amelia, and her infant daughter. Will Shutt was eager to assist them, and despite the emotional distress of it, gave them permission to exhume his wife's body to try and see if poison could be found. Although the prosecution didn't discover arsenic in her blood, as they had hoped, they did discover copper deposits in her tissues, indicating that a foreign substance had been introduced into her body. Once again, they did not have definitive proof that Roloff was responsible for the deaths, or that they were provably murdered. As this was going on, Roloff received a sentence of death for his conviction of murdering Priscilla. But as a result of this, the door was opened for another appeal, with attorney Francis Finch taking up his case to challenge the verdict. Phrenologists analyzed Roloff's head, concluding that his unusually large head indicated significant intelligence, and combined with his charming and charismatic personality, people began to question if he really was guilty. Ultimately, Finch argued before the justices that while circumstantial evidence could be legally sufficient for a conviction, the mere disappearance of a person did not automatically prove a crime. The justice agreed, declaring that conclusive proof was necessary for a death sentence and ultimately resulting in his release. The Roloff Rule, which stipulated that additional evidence beyond the absence of a body was necessary to prove murder, was established in New York law for many years. Following his release, Roloff fled westward on foot, surviving on wild nuts and stolen farm produce, but he lost 2 toes to frostbite along the way. Upon reaching Meadville, Pennsylvania, Roloff introduced himself to a local inventor using the alias James Nelson. He impressed him with his extensive knowledge, convincing him to enter a business partnership. He similarly impressed the faculty at Jefferson College in southwestern Pennsylvania, and was on the verge of securing a professorship when he received a letter from Albert Jarvis. Jarvis informed him that both he and his mother were now destitute and threatened Roloff if he didn't offer financial assistance. In response, Roloff robbed a jewelry store with the intention of giving the proceeds to the Jarvis family. However, he was soon arrested and imprisoned, serving 2 years under a false identity in jail. And it was here that he met William Dexter. Upon their release, Roloff, Dexter, and Jarvis formed a criminal trio, with the 2 young men in their 20s following the older, more experienced, and more intelligent Roloff to plan their schemes. Operating out of New York City, the trio specialized in stealing luxury fabrics, which were less likely to be traced. By day, Roloff tutored the young men in ancient languages, classical poetry, and writing. At night, Jarvis and Dexter engaged in burglaries targeting silk merchants, small-town banks, and large dry goods stores. Roloff balanced his criminal activities with his academic ambitions. While his accomplices stole, he continued working diligently on his manuscript. Things which are opposites in meaning are named from the same roots, in which the elements are reversed, Roloff wrote. Take the words stir and rest, for example, the meanings of which are opposites. In stir, the roots is composed of str. In rest, these are reversed, rst. It was at this time that Roloff offered to sell his manuscript for the ludicrous $500,000 at the American Philological Association meeting in Poughkeepsie, New York, where the leading experts in the field ridiculed him and his theories. This led to an eruption of anger from Roloff, who declared his intention to fund and publish his work independently, believing his ideas would change the world. In the summer of 1870, Roloff, Jarvis, and Dexter set their sights on a dry goods store in Binghamton, New York, near the Shenango River. The plan, however, as you already know, went disastrously wrong, resulting in the deaths of Jarvis, Dexter, and an innocent night clerk, leaving Roloff the lone survivor to face the consequences. After finally being identified, the prosecution now knew they were about to try and convict a man who had been accused of murdering 2 women and 2 infants already, and despite stints in jail, had evaded being properly and definitively proven responsible for either. This time, Roloff's wealthy brother hired George Becker and Charles Beale to lead his defense with a twofold strategy: to question whether Roloff had even been in town during the crime, and should that fail, to argue that any shooting he may have done was in defense of Jarvis after he was physically attacked. A now extremely high-profile trial, Roloff believed he could fund it by writing an autobiography, because, of course he did. But instead, his brother offered to cover the costs for him. The trial began on January 4, 1871, attracting extensive coverage from both local and national newspapers, in a courtroom packed with over 2,000 spectators, twice its maximum capacity. Roloff's intelligence, often described as genius, challenged the typical criminal stereotype of the time, fueling further curiosity and attracting attention from overseas, with many speculating that someone so intelligent could not be a murderer. At the time, the concept of psychopathy was not well understood, but in hindsight, it seems clear that Roloff was a psychopath. Back then, individuals who violated social norms for personal gain without feeling remorse were unsettling to others, and fueled ongoing debates among mental health experts about dangerousness and homicidal insanity. Some even speculated that the brain contained an organ of murder. Although these individuals appeared mentally sound, something fundamental to their humanity seemed absent. This idea that apparently normal, charming, or intelligent members of society couldn't also be monsters likely played a key role in the various trials throughout Roloff's life. As while his personality very much falls in line with what we now know about psychopaths and serial killers, opinions at the time were very different. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Dexter, Jarvis, and Roloff had broken into the store, and one of them had shot and killed Merrick, with Jarvis and Dexter drowning as they tried to escape. The specialized shoes, alongside a newspaper clipping found in a bag discarded during the escape that matched a newspaper in Roloff's quarters, were the initial pieces of evidence they claimed proved definitively that Roloff was involved in the burglary. The surviving night clerk, Burroughs, testified about his experience during the incident, with Roloff cross-examining him himself to try and undermine his confidence in identifying him as the third burglar. Despite this, Burroughs remained steadfast that the very man cross-examining him was without a doubt the third burglar. The next piece of evidence introduced was a handwriting analysis aimed at linking Roloff to the burglars, a note found in one of their pockets. Comparing the note to Roloff's extensive amount of writing, including his manuscript, which Roloff claimed was proof he spent his time devoted to scholarly pursuits and not petty crime, they analyzed the handwriting, claiming it belonged to him. Ultimately, the judge ruled there was enough evidence to establish that the 3 men were accomplices, meaning the only question left was whether Roloff had been the one to pull the trigger or not. Initially, Roloff's defense tried to claim that Jarvis had shot Merrick, but this idea was hard to sell, with the surviving night clerk stating emphatically that Roloff had fired the weapon. So Roloff's defense now made the claim that he had assured Merrick that they meant no harm, but that the young clerk had attacked them so aggressively that he had no choice but to act in self-defense. He asserted that Merrick had attempted to shoot him at close range before grabbing Jarvis, leading him to fire his weapon in a desperate act to protect his friend. Roloff then claimed that after fleeing the scene, Jarvis convinced them that the river was shallow and safe to cross when they missed their boat, but once they entered, They found the water was much deeper than expected, resulting in Jarvis, who was injured, and Dexter, who couldn't swim, drowning. Many have speculated, however, that Roloff manipulated his two accomplices to get into the river with the hope they would drown to remove any witnesses linking him to the crime. Ultimately, the jury deliberated for only 4.5 hours before delivering a guilty verdict for first-degree murder. When asked by the judge if he had any reason why the death sentence shouldn't be pronounced, Roloff declined to speak, leading him to being sentenced to hang on March 3, 1871. Yet this was still not the end of Roloff's story. Locked up in his cell, Roloff became a figure of intense curiosity, seen as a monster with exceptional intellectual abilities, leading many scholars to correspond with him. By now, it was widely accepted that he had killed his wife and daughter, that he had most likely killed his sister-in-law and her child, and that he may have even drowned his two accomplices. Yet his only official victim was Merrick, the night clerk. With his notoriety growing, Roloff achieved a strange sort of celebrity status, and the groundbreaking ideas around language and writing he was so convinced he had developed gained a lot of attention. Playing up to this genius killer role, he made sure he was always reading and writing in his cell when anybody came to see him. He attempted to argue against his execution by claiming his intellectual contributions to philology would revolutionize the understanding of language and human behavior, and it should at least be delayed until he could finish his manuscript for the sake of the world. While the sheriff began printing special invitations to his upcoming hanging, many of the scholars corresponding with Roloff began to argue his case, claiming that he should be studied rather than executed. An article in the New York Tribune, written by a Republican candidate, stated, "In the prison at Binghamton, there is a man waiting death who is too curious an intellectual problem to be wasted on the gallows. He is one of the most industrious and devoted scholars our busy generation has given birth to." Many who spent time with him claimed he was genuinely knowledgeable in many fields and was a talented scholar of languages. Yet simultaneously, other intellectuals dismissed him as an egotistical fraud who could simply spout the odd Latin phrase or bit of obscure trivia to sound smart, with his writings being either hoaxes or the ramblings of a hopeless egomaniac. Mark Twain even contributed a piece to the Tribune, urging that someone else should take Roloff's place on the gallows due to his exceptional intelligence. Twain wrote, "What miracles this murderer might have wrought, and what luster he might have shed upon his country if he had not put a forfeit upon his life so foolishly." Though Twain's essay was intended as satire, he privately hoped to spark a national debate on the possibility of commuting Roloff's death sentence. Politicians, editors, and academics joined the debate. Some argued that Roloff might be insane, and that executing him would be unjust. Others questioned the morality of capital punishment, while some believed his work in linguistics might justify a postponement of his execution. Roloff conducted several interviews with the press, where he finally confessed to killing his wife, though he continued to deny he had murdered his daughter. He even offered the ominous and disturbing words regarding his own approaching death. "You cannot kill an unquiet spirit." In the days leading up to his execution, Roloff began destroying much of his writing, though his manuscript was safely locked away in a bank vault. Roloff confided in his attorney, claiming he was a martyr to science and believed himself to be wronged. Finally, the day of his execution arrived. On May 18th, 1871, Roloff was led to the gallows in front of a sizable crowd. Roloff, still convinced he wouldn't be executed, eagerly awaited a last-minute pardon from the governor that never arrived. As he stood on the gallows, awaiting his death, Roloff allegedly turned to the hangman and said, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." With a white hood pulled over his head, Roloff was hoisted up with a sudden jerk, struggling for around 20 minutes before he finally succumbed, with his neck failing to break. This was to be New York State's last public execution. Some viewed it as a fitting end for a man whose life had been marked by violence, while opponents of the death penalty used it as a rallying point against capital punishment. Intriguingly, there's a persistent legend suggesting that Roloff might have been innocent of the murder of his infant daughter. In an article in the Times that appeared shortly after his hanging, they claim to have found Roloff's daughter alive and well in Pennsylvania, under the care of his brother. According to the article, she was now 25 and running a hotel, believing Roloff was her uncle, despite speculation in the community. Some believe that his niece, born in the same year and also named Priscilla, might have been secretly taken to his brother's home in Maine and passed off as his own daughter. But whether there's any truth to this theory, we'll likely never know. Numerous individuals fought for possession of Roloff's remains, wanting to study him further even after his death. A death mask was created of him to display in an art gallery, and his actual body was even put on public display for curious onlookers to see. Ultimately, Dr. George Burr from the Geneva Medical College acquired the body, intending to keep the skull and brain for scientific analysis, under the belief that insights into Roloff's criminal tendencies might be discovered. Removing Roloff's head was a challenging task due to his unusually thick neck muscles. The skull proved resistant to the saw, being nearly twice as thick as normal, taking Dr. Burr almost an hour to cut through. While he buried the rest of the body, it was exhumed later by medical students and eventually found in a potter's field. With Roloff's brain and skull, Dr. Burr embarked on a lecture tour, claiming the brain's size and characteristics explained why the animal part of Roloff, and not the moral part of him, dominated his brain, claiming he was not truly responsible for his crimes, as it was in his biology. He measured Roloff's brain at 59 ounces, making it one of the largest ever recorded, and according to Burr, similar in size to renowned geniuses. Today, modern scientists place Roloff's brain in the top 1% in terms of size. However, modern scientists also now know that brain size and shape does not correlate with intellect or superiority. While some scientists like Burr attributed Roloff's behavior to his brain structure, respected alienists tasked with evaluating his mental state concluded otherwise. After interviewing him in prison, these psychiatrists acknowledged Roloff's intelligence and troubled nature, but deemed him in sound physical health and entirely sane, arguing his execution was morally justified. Eventually, the brain ended up in the possession of Bert Green Wilder, a biologist at Cornell University, who built up a collection of 600 brains, hoping to investigate whether variations in size, shape, chemistry, or weight could explain certain behaviors and personality traits. The brain was ultimately preserved in formalin in a glass jar. In fact, Roloff's brain played a key role in the work of Dr. Wilder, who compared the brains of criminals, women, and different ethnicities against those of elite white men to prove that regardless of race, sex, or moral standing, there were similarities among all brains, not differences. Wilder was actually the first to make such claims in the scientific community, presenting groundbreaking evidence that has since been supported by modern neuroscientists in stark contrast to the beliefs of the time. The Wellcome Center in London later recognized Roloff's brain as the most notorious brain in US history, a testament to its lasting impact. In Ithaca, New York, there was even a pub named after Roloff, claiming he was a learned murderer and that he was a physician, lawyer, scholar, draftsman, carpenter, and spoke 28 languages. Although not all opinions on his true intellect or ability are as kind as his namesake pub's write-up, Roloff is unquestionably one of the most complex and notable killers in the annals of American true crime. The New York Times described Edward Roloff in their damning obituary as a man of great pretension and excessive vanity, noting his troubled past: a thief in his youth, a convict who spent 18 of his 51 years behind bars, a bungler in criminal endeavors, and a fraud in his scholarly pursuits, distinguished only by his depravity. Roloff's story raises enduring questions about the coexistence of brilliance and malevolence in the human mind, continuing to intrigue and challenge our understanding of the criminal psyche, reflecting ongoing efforts to unravel its mysteries. Roloff was a figure of deep contradiction, admired by some as a pioneering intellect poised to transform the field of philology, and dismissed by others as a charlatan and con artist. To this day, Roloff's brain remains part of the Wilder Brain Collection at Cornell University. And with that, our exploration of this dark and disturbing case comes to a close. Let me know your thoughts about this one down in the comments section below. Do you think Roloff was truly responsible for all 7 deaths linked to him? Do you think he was as smart and intelligent as he believed himself to be? Or was he just a charming fraudster? Would our understanding of his narcissism and personality disorders have impacted his death sentence in the modern age, or helped to stop his spree of murders before many of them could have even happened? Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and please check out some of my other true crime content up on the channel. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss. If you're watching this video the day it goes up on YouTube, then it's October 31st. While I typically drop new cases on a Monday at the moment, I wanted to give you something spooky to sit down and watch this chilly Halloween evening. Both supernatural and historical true crime cases are among the most popular my channel currently covers. So this Halloween, I thought we'd combine them both and go back more than 2 centuries to 1809, when a 40-year-old witch, Mary Bateman, was executed in front of a crowd of thousands at York Castle in England. But unlike the many cases where women were falsely accused, Mary openly practiced witchcraft and used her supernatural abilities and magical concoctions to instill fear in and take advantage of her victims, earning her the nickname the Yorkshire Witch. Living nearly 100 years after England had stopped executing witches, Mary was allowed to sell her services and practice her craft freely. Well, that is until the authorities discovered the string of robberies, poisonings, and brutal murders that she had left in her wake. After her hanging, Mary's body was put on public display and viewed by 2,500 visitors, before strips of her supposedly magical skin were turned into leather and sold as charms to protect against evil spirits. Up until recently, Mary's skeleton was on display in the Thackeray Museum of Medicine in Leeds, where many have claimed her spirit still walks the halls of the old building at night searching for new victims. So this Halloween, let's find out what Mary did to suffer from this dark fate, how she managed to convince thousands of people she was a powerful witch, and why many believe her ghost still lingers to this very day. This is the creepy story of Much of what we know about Mary's life comes from the extraordinary life and character of Mary Bateman, published shortly after her trial and execution. Born Mary Harker in 1768 to a respectable farming family in Isenby, North Yorkshire, Mary displayed signs of her future sly and deceitful nature from an early age. For example, at the young age of 5, she attempted to sell shoes she had been stealing and hiding in the barn over a number of weeks. By the time she was 12, Mary began working as a domestic servant in the nearby town of Thirsk, where she was expected to stay until she married and started her own family. However, Mary quickly lost the job after being caught stealing from her employer. Also caught stealing in multiple similar roles, she moved between several employers throughout her teenage years and had soon been fired from so many jobs that no one would hire her anymore. Eventually, she was able to secure a role as a dressmaker in Leeds with the help of a family friend. But this job producing clothing paid very poorly. So to supplement her income, Mary not only continued committing petty thefts, but also began dabbling in witchcraft, which quickly became her main source of income. In this role, she offered fortune-telling, brewed love potions, and claimed to remove evil wishes for local servant girls and their employers. By 1792, at 24 years old, Mary met and married a wheelwright called John Bateman after just 3 weeks of courtship. However, less than 2 months into their marriage, he began to regret his hasty decision when he discovered Mary's hidden life of crime. With the pair having moved into a boarding home until they could sort a permanent house for themselves, he discovered that she had been stealing from the other lodgers in the building. But rather than turning his wife in, John covered up her crimes, and the couple swiftly found a house to move to. Not long after, Mary forged various letters claiming to be from reputable clients she pretended she was working for, and used them to acquire dresses and goods from stores, claiming the clients would pay for them, before selling them on for profit. She even tricked her husband into believing that his father, the Thirsk town crier, was gravely ill. While he was away attending to his father, Mary sold their clothes and furniture to settle a debt she owed to one of her victims. Carrying out numerous scams to make money, Mary evaded prosecution by convincing her husband to constantly move to new towns, even after the pair became parents. In the handful of times she was arrested and accused of crimes, Mary managed to escape punishment by bribing witnesses. What role, if any, John played in his wife's crimes is unclear, though at the very least his actions enabled her. At one point, John enlisted in the army. While many accounts claim he did this to get away from his wife, as he'd been driven mad by her constant scams and crimes, in reality, Mary went with him, and within only a year they had returned to Leeds together. By 1799, Mary had set up shop out of their new home in Marsh Lane near Quarry Hill, where she quickly established a reputation as a wise woman, a type of witch that combined Christian prayers with their charms and spells, rather than a traditional witch adhering to pagan beliefs. With little understanding of medicine in those days, many turned to witchcraft for help, and Mary was more than happy to exploit this belief, tricking vulnerable individuals out of their money and possessions with false prophecies and questionable potions. She offered a variety of services as a wise woman, such as helping people locate lost items, treating ailments, healing animals, and even influencing the weather. She convinced one woman that her husband was facing a death sentence in jail, duping her into giving Mary 4 gold pieces for her supposed help. Another woman, believing her husband was being unfaithful, handed over everything she owned to Mary, in hopes of her spells fixing her predicament. Then, in 1805, Mary began boasting that she owned a hen that was able to predict the end of the world. According to her, the hen would lay eggs inscribed with phrases like, "Christ is coming." But obviously Mary didn't let the public see this magical hen for free, charging them a penny to come and look at the prophet hen of Leeds. And according to some accounts, by this point her husband was sharing in the profits of her unethical activities. Many people witnessed the hen laying these prophetic eggs, believing it to be a true miracle. Yet when she eventually sold the animal to a neighbor, it never laid anything other than normal eggs. Later investigations revealed that Mary had written on the eggs using ink before reinserting them into the hen's oviduct. Around this time, Mary attended gatherings led by Joanna Southcott, a Christian prophet predicting the imminent end of the world. She soon began using Joanna's name to lend credibility to her own practices, even though she had no permission to do so. Mary also relied heavily on her connections with two famous wise women who helped guide and mentor her, known as Mrs. Moore and Mrs. Blythe. According to Mary, Mrs. Moore was the seventh child of a seventh child and possessed the ability to supernaturally blind anyone who posed a threat to her clients, and Mrs. Blythe was a psychic who could read the stars. Before long, clients began flocking to Mary's home, paying her to send letters to these two wise women to solve their issues or reveal their futures. Mary would then charge her clients for the remedies the two women recommended for them. In essence, Mary became a storefront for these two soothsayers, selling a range of magical potions and charms that they claimed could repel curses, ward off evil, and even cure illnesses. Disturbingly, several reports also claim that Mary worked as a back-alley abortionist at the time, which was an extremely shady and dangerous job that frequently resulted in significant harm and even death to those who received treatment. Mary skillfully orchestrated her deceptions. She sought out the anxious and the sick, promising magical solutions to their troubles. With her seemingly kind demeanor and her supposed powerful connections, Mary rarely lacked customers. While these enterprises proved lucrative, it seems that Mary's ambition, combined with her complete lack of morality, led her down an even darker path, one that was about to transition from witchcraft and robbery to outright murder. Mary's first known victims were three women from the Kitchen family. She began by befriending them, occasionally assisting in their drapery shop in St. Peter's Square in Quarry Hill. Mary also offered to tell their fortunes, using insights from Mrs. Blythe. When one of the women fell ill from an unknown ailment, Mary took it upon herself to nurse her better, administering special powders she had concocted. Tragically, all three women soon died. Mary attributed their deaths to the plague, and out of fear of contagion, and fear of crossing Mary, the local community remained silent. When creditors later investigated the Kitchen estate, they found the drapery shop and home stripped of their contents, with the account books mysteriously missing. The investigative processes of the time were far less thorough than today, and her explanation went unchallenged, sparing her from any further inquiries, at least for the time. Similarly, another act of poisoning that occurred around the same time was later linked back to Mary, though no proof actually exists that she was behind it. A poor family with several children stumbled across a cake which they all hungrily ate, only to fall violently sick. Thankfully, all of them survived, but when authorities checked the cake, they discovered it had been laced with arsenic. There are many similar cases in the area that occurred at this time, some of which resulted in death. Whether Mary was behind any of these poisonings will never truly be known. Then, in 1806, now operating out of her new home in the aptly named Black Dog Yard, Mary found a pair of new clients in William and Rebecca Perigo, a wealthy and childless couple who sought out her help after believing Rebecca was suffering from a curse. Rebecca had complained about a fluttering sensation in her chest and claimed to be haunted by a black dog and other spirits, with some indication that she suffered from psychosis. Initially, the couple had visited a quack doctor who told them that her condition was incurable as it wasn't medical, telling them that it was an evil wish that required witchcraft to resolve. Rebecca's niece, aware of Mary's reputation as a healer with supernatural powers, recommended that they contact her to see if she could help them. So the Perigos went to visit Mary, who told them about Mrs. Blythe and her belief that the wise woman could fix their problems. After sending a letter to Mrs. Blythe, she told them that they needed to give Mary 4 guinea notes to post out to her, and in exchange Mary would sew 4 guinea notes Mrs. Blythe had provided into a silk purse and place it inside their bed. She told them that they needed to leave the charms untouched for at least 18 months, else they wouldn't work. Leaving the couple's home, Mary told them to visit her regularly, as she would be receiving letters from Mrs. Blythe with guidance on how to further help them to remove their curse. Around 2 weeks later, a new letter arrived, instructing the couple to nail 2 horseshoe-shaped pieces of iron to their door, using the back of a pair of pincers. The trusting Perigos, thankful that they were finally receiving help, obliged. Over the preceding months, Mrs. Blythe sent the Perigos constant letters through Mary, instructing them to provide various magical supplies, including money, china, silverware, cheese, sugar, tea, bed linens, and even a substantial amount of money, more than would be earned annually by most skilled workers at the time. All of these items and finances, it was claimed, would be used to create spells and cures for the couple's curse, and they were ordered to burn each letter they read once they had given over the goods to Mary, to avoid evil spirits reading them and counteracting them. Blindly trusting Mary and Mrs. Blythe, the couple were too afraid not to follow the instructions, with many of the letters threatening danger should they fail to do so. Then, in April 1808, the couple received a letter from Mrs. Blythe warning that a terrible illness was about to befall them, and that they needed to bring Mary half a pound of honey for her to mix with a special substance for them to create puddings that would cure them. The letter warned them that no matter what happened, they were not to seek medical help, and that they had to dispose of any unfinished pudding. Should they fail to adhere strictly to the instructions, the letter warned that they would both die. So following the instructions, the couple ate the puddings on the exact days and at the exact times they were told to. For the first 5 days, the puddings tasted normal. But when they ate the 6th pudding, the taste was so foul that William could only manage a single bite of it. Rebecca, on the other hand, forced herself to eat her entire pudding, scared of the repercussions if she didn't. The couple were both immediately struck with severe vomiting after eating the final pudding. Despite enduring unbearable pain, Rebecca refused to let her husband send for a doctor, fearing doing so would break the spell. While William's lips turned black and he suffered horrific headaches and abdominal pain, he gradually began to get better. In stark contrast, his wife grew sicker and sicker before finally passing away in agony on May 24th. Reports from that time described her as having a severely swollen tongue and distorted features when she died. Yet despite all this, William didn't even consider that the puddings, let alone Mary or Mrs. Blythe, were behind his sickness and his wife's death. Instead, he saw it as proof that the letter's threat of illness befalling them, and leading to death if they failed to perfectly follow its instructions, was all real. After Rebecca's death, a surgeon was called to examine her body, and strongly suspected she had been poisoned, especially when he learned that a cat had also died after eating some of the leftover pudding, but no further investigation was pursued. By October, however, after continuing to correspond with Mary and her guide, and continuing to purchase various requested items, the initial 18 months William had been told not to touch the charms under his bed had come and passed. Wanting to see if the charms were really working, he decided to check them, expecting to find guinea notes sewn into silk purses in the bed. Instead, he discovered nothing but rotten cabbage leaves, and the tragic truth dawned on him. Every single interaction with Mary and Mrs. Blythe had been a lie. Realizing he had been deceived and that his wife had been poisoned, William arranged a meeting with Mary, pretending to be interested in purchasing more potions from Mrs. Blythe. In reality, he contacted the police, telling them Mary had murdered his wife and arranged for them to arrest her at the meeting. Mary arrived with a bottle containing a mixture of oatmeal and arsenic, presumably intended to finish off William since the pudding had failed. When the police rushed out to apprehend her, she tried to claim that William had been trying to sell the potion to her, not the other way around. But the police knew she was lying and hastily arrested her. Despite her claims of innocence, a quick search of her home uncovered various items that the Perigos had given her to send to Mrs. Blythe. All of them had been kept and used by Mary herself. They also discovered various poisons, including a deadly mixture of mercuric chloride, which had been put into the pudding that killed Rebecca. This time, even Mary's smooth talking couldn't save her, and she was taken to York Castle, where she was formally charged with the murder of Rebecca Perigo. In the early 1800s, courts only held trials at a handful of points through the year, meaning prisoners often had to wait for their cases to be heard. So although Mary was arrested in October 1808, her trial didn't occur until March 1809. During her trial, Mary tried to pin the blame on the elusive Mrs. Blythe, but her defense was quickly dismissed when the prosecution easily proved that Mrs. Blythe, alongside all of Mary's other supernatural contacts, never even existed. It soon became apparent that all of the letters sent to the Perigos had been written by Mary herself, with the supposed Mrs. Blythe's handwriting being identical to Mary's own. Mary had been charging postage to send letters to her imaginary guides, pocketing the money, forging responses, and then keeping whatever goods the fake letters demanded in a scam she had been running for years. Numerous witnesses testified to her long history of fraud, robbery, and other criminal activities, with the prosecution even bringing out shop owners who had sold arsenic to her in the past. As witnesses came forward from all over Leeds to recount their experiences of deception and extortion at Mary's hands, it quickly became clear that her crimes extended far beyond what had initially been understood by the court. It seemed clear to many that Mary had been behind the deaths of the Kitchen family a couple of years earlier, and was likely intending to loot and rob the Perigos after their deaths as she had done to them. The most damning testimony came from the surgeon who had re-examined Rebecca's body, who confirmed that the remains of the pudding contained a lethal dose of poison, with the symptoms exhibited by the Perigos perfectly matching those of mercury poisoning, with evidence clearly showing that Rebecca had been deliberately poisoned by Mary. After a short deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict, leading the judge to state the following: "Of your guilt, there cannot remain a particle of doubt in the breast of anyone who has heard your case. For crimes like yours, in this world, the gates of mercy are closed." The judge then sentenced her to death by hanging. When questioned if she had anything to say in response to her sentence, Mary made the shocking claim that she was pregnant so she could not be killed. In response, many women in the courtroom tried to leave, as they knew they could be called to serve as a jury of matrons. This jury would be responsible for determining whether Mary was telling the truth, as the law at the time stated that if a woman was found to be at least 4.5 months pregnant, her execution would be postponed until after childbirth. So the judge ordered the doors of the courtroom to be locked, allowing him to select 12 married women from the crowd to be the jury of matrons. Mary was then taken to another room, where the 12 women quickly determined that her claim was false, allowing her to be taken back to prison to await her execution. While in prison, a reverend attempted to get Mary to confess to her crimes, but she refused to admit to anything, showing no signs of remorse, guilt, or shame. Despite being outed as a liar and con artist in court, Mary continued to present herself as a witch to her fellow prisoners. She even managed to convince a young female inmate who wished to see her sweetheart that if she let her sew money into a charm for her to wear, she could ensure her partner would visit. The young woman was able to find and pay the money, but her sweetheart never appeared. When she opened the charm, she discovered that the money had mysteriously disappeared. After finding out what she'd done, the prison governor intervened and ordered Mary to refund the amount she hadn't already spent. On the day before her execution, she wrote a letter to her husband, enclosing her wedding ring which she requested he pass on to their daughter. In the letter, she confessed to her fraudulent actions, but asserted that she had never intended for anyone to die. Even on the morning of her execution, Mary refused to admit her guilt or accept that her sentence was justified. Instead, she remained composed as she ascended the gallows. A profound silence fell over the large crowd that had gathered to witness the execution, with many superstitious onlookers believing Mary might use her supernatural powers to somehow escape death at the last moment. But when the noose tightened, she did not vanish. Just before the drop, the Reverend urged her again to confess, but Mary reiterated that she was innocent. So the lever was pulled, and Mary met her end on March 20th, 1809. Meanwhile, back in Leeds, 2,500 residents had each paid 3 pence to view her body upon its return to the town. The crowds, entertained by jugglers and balladeers, waited late into the night, eating and drinking from vendors selling pies and ale. At midnight, the hearse finally arrived, and people lined up to get a look at the body. Afterward, her corpse was taken to Leeds General Hospital for dissection. Mary's body was skinned after the dissection, being scraped and tanned, with the skin being sold in small pieces as macabre talismans to ward off evil. In fact, her skin was even used to bind several books, including at least one that was reportedly owned by the future King George IV. Referred to as the Yorkshire Witch for obvious reasons, many of the residents of Yorkshire believed Mary had likely been responsible for many more murders beyond that of Rebecca and the 3 Kitchen family members. And because of this, she is frequently referred to as a serial killer. Mary's skeleton remained on display in the Thackeray Museum of Medicine in Leeds until recently, where it has been claimed that her spirit haunts the halls of the old building in search of new victims. Interestingly, Mary's ghost is only one of many claimed to haunt the halls of the Thackeray Museum of Medicine, with some other famous sightings including a 19th-century woman known as the Grey Lady, and a white-coated doctor who's said to linger within the recreated Victorian streets in the museum. There have been countless reports of visitors hearing knocking and banging, being grabbed by ghostly hands, and experiencing rapid drops in temperature and intense feelings of dread and discomfort. The location is so popular among ghost hunters that it was even once featured in an episode of Most Haunted. And with that, our bonus Halloween episode comes to a close. So, what did you think of this historic supernatural case? Was it one you'd heard of before today? Let me know your thoughts on it down in the comments section below. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, consider subscribing and checking out my brand new Patreon, and be sure to comment down below as it really helps with the algorithm here on YouTube. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss.